Imagine this. You're walking down a quiet street, minding your own business, when suddenly, out of nowhere, someone decides to make you their target. They size you up, thinking you're an easy mark, someone they can intimidate or push around. But what if appearances were deceiving? What if the person they thought was weak, timid, or defenseless turned out to be the last person they should have messed with? That's exactly what happens in today's story. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for every single second of it. Because by the end of this video, you'll not only get the answer to why this thug picked the wrong guy to mess with, but you'll also witness one of the most jaw-dropping, satisfying turnarounds you've ever seen. So, if you're ready for a story that's equal parts shocking, thrilling, and downright unforgettable, let's dive in. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you? Maybe it was a bully at school, a coworker who thought they could walk all over you, or even a stranger who assumed you wouldn't stand up for yourself. If so, then you already know how infuriating it can feel to be judged based on appearances alone. And that's exactly what makes this story so relatable. It's not just about a guy who gets picked on, it's about what happens when the tables turn in the most unexpected way. It's about the moment when the underdog reveals they were never the underdog at all. And let me tell you, that moment is coming, but we're not there yet. So, buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. Let's set the scene. Picture a small, unassuming town somewhere in America. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing too exciting ever seems to happen. But on this particular day, something is about to go down that will have the entire town talking for weeks. Our story begins with two men, one a loudmouth thug who's used to getting his way, and the other a quiet, unassuming guy who looks like he wouldn't hurt a fly. At first glance, it's easy to see why the thug might think he has the upper hand. He's bigger, louder, and more aggressive, while the other guy seems almost too calm, too reserved, like he's trying to avoid any kind of confrontation. But here's the thing, sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. And as we're about to find out, this unassuming man has a secret one that's going to change everything. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, so the quiet guy is actually a badass. What's the big deal? But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just some random guy who knows how to throw a punch. No, this man has a history, a past that's filled with triumphs, struggles, and a level of skill that most people can only dream of. He's not just a fighter, he's a champion. And not just any champion, but one who's faced some of the toughest opponents in the world and come out on top. But here's the kicker. He's not the kind of person who goes around flaunting his accomplishments. In fact, he's the complete opposite. He's humble, reserved, and prefers to keep his past exactly where it belongs, in the past. But when push comes to shove, literally he's not afraid to remind people why he's earned the title of champion. So, how does this all play out? Well, that's where the thug comes in. He's the kind of guy who thrives on intimidation. He's used to people backing down, used to getting his way without having to lift a finger. But this time, he's picked the wrong target. What starts as a typical confrontation, a few harsh words, a shove, maybe even a threat quickly escalates into something much bigger. And as the tension builds, you can't help but wonder, how far is this thug willing to go? And more importantly, how far is the quiet man willing to push back? Because here's the thing, when someone is pushed to their limit, there's no telling what they're capable of. And in this case, the quiet man's limit is about to be tested in a way that will leave everyone, including the thug, completely stunned. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we get to the explosive climax, let's take a moment to really understand the key players in this story. First, there's the thug. He's not just your average bully. He's someone who's built his entire identity around being the toughest guy in the room. He's the kind of person who believes that strength is everything, and he's not afraid to use his size and aggression to get what he wants. But beneath all that bravado, there's a sense of insecurity, a fear that one day someone might come along who's stronger, faster, and more skilled than he is. And that fear is about to become a reality. Then there's the quiet man. At first glance, he's the complete opposite of the thug. He's not loud, he's not flashy, and he certainly doesn't go around looking for trouble. But what he lacks in outward aggression, he more than makes up for in discipline, focus, and raw talent. He's spent years honing his craft, perfecting his technique, and pushing himself to be the best. And while he may not look like much on the surface, those who know him understand that he's not someone to be underestimated. But here's the thing, even those who know him don't fully understand the depth of his skill. Because when the moment comes, when he's finally pushed to his limit, he's going to reveal a side of himself that no one, not even the thug, could have anticipated. And that's where we're headed. But before we get to the moment that changes everything, let's take a step back and talk about why this story is so important. It's not just about a fight or a confrontation. It's about the power of perseverance, the importance of humility, and the idea that true strength isn't about how big or loud you are. It's about what you're capable of when it matters most. It's a reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover, because you never know what someone is truly capable of until they're put to the test. And in this case, the test is about to get very real. So, as we move forward, keep this in mind. This isn't just a story about a thug who picks on the wrong guy. It's a story about redemption, about standing up for yourself, and about proving that no matter how tough someone might seem, there's always someone out there who's tougher. And when that moment comes, when the quiet man finally decides to show the thug what he's made of, it's going to be a moment you'll never forget. But we're not there yet. We're still building up to that explosive climax, and trust me, it's going to be worth the wait. Now, let's talk about the setting. As I mentioned earlier, this story takes place in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. It's the kind of town where news travels fast, and where a single event can become the talk of the town for weeks. And on this particular day, the town is about to witness something that will go down in history. It all starts in a quiet park, the kind of place where people go to relax, unwind, and escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But on this day, the park is about to become the stage for a confrontation that no one will soon forget. The thug is there, as usual, looking for trouble. He's the kind of guy who can't go a day without causing some kind of trauma, and today is no different. He's loud, obnoxious, and looking for someone to push around. And that's when he spots the quiet man. At first, the thug doesn't think much of him. He's just another face in the crowd, someone who looks like an easy target. But as the thug approaches, something feels off. There's a calmness about the quiet man, a sense of confidence that doesn't quite match his appearance. But the thug doesn't notice, or if he does, he doesn't care. He's too focused on the thrill of the moment, too caught up in his own ego to realize that he's about to make the biggest mistake of his life. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the tension is building. But what happens next? How does the quiet man respond when the thug finally crosses the line? And more importantly, what happens when the thug realizes that he's picked on the wrong guy? You'll have to keep watching to find out. Because trust me, the moment the quiet man reveals his true power is a moment you won't want to miss. So, stay tuned because this story is just getting started and it's about to get a whole lot more intense. The quiet man, whose name we'll soon come to know as Jack, had been living a life of deliberate simplicity in this small town for the past few years. To the casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd, a man who kept to himself, worked a modest job at the local auto repair shop, and spent his evenings either jogging along the river or reading in the park. But there was more to Jack than met the eye, and his recent activities hinted at a life that was far from ordinary. For one, he had a strict routine that bordered on obsessive up at dawn, a 5-mile run, followed by hours of shadowboxing in the privacy of his garage. It wasn't something he advertised, and the few neighbors who had noticed chalked it up to eccentricity. But those who paid closer attention might have noticed the faint scars on his knuckles, the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence, or the occasional visitor who showed up at his doorman with hardened faces and a certain intensity in their eyes. These visitors never stayed long, but their presence was enough to spark whispers among the townsfolk. Who was Jack, really? And why did he seem to attract people who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime thriller? Jack's relationships in town were few, but meaningful. He was on friendly terms with his co-workers at the repair shop, though he rarely shared much about his personal life. There was a waitress at the local diner, Sarah, who had taken a liking to him, often slipping him an extra piece of pie with his coffee. She'd tried to get him to open up a few times, but Jack always deflected with a polite smile or a vague answer. Then there was old Mr. Thompson, the retired schoolteacher who lived next door. Mr. Thompson had taken it upon himself to be a sort of surrogate grandfather to Jack, often inviting him over for dinner or to help with odd jobs around the house. It was during one of these dinners that Mr. Thompson had noticed the framed photo on Jack's mantel, a younger version of Jack, standing in a boxing ring, his arms raised in victory. When Mr. Thompson had asked about it, Jack had simply said that was a long time ago and changed the subject. But the photo had stuck in Mr. Thompson's mind, and he couldn't help but wonder what had brought Jack to this quiet town and why he seemed so determined to leave his past behind. As for the thug, whose name was Vince, he was a recent addition to the town's social fabric. He'd rolled in a few months ago, driving a beat-up muscle car and trailing a reputation for trouble. Vince wasn't from around here, and he made no effort to fit in. He spent most of his time at the local bar, where he'd quickly established himself as the resident tough guy. He'd pick fights with anyone who looked at him the wrong way, and his loud, brash demeanor had earned him a small following of hangers-on who were either too scared or too impressed to stand up to him. But Vince's behavior had started to escalate in recent weeks. He'd been involved in a few altercations that had left people bruised and shaken, and there were rumors that he'd been seen hanging around with some shady characters from out of town. The townsfolk had started to avoid him, but Vince didn't seem to care. If anything, he seemed to thrive on the fear and discomfort he caused. And then, one day, he set his sights on Jack. What Vince didn't know, what no one in town knew, was that Jack had been keeping a low profile for a reason. A few years ago, he'd been a rising star in the boxing world, a fighter with a reputation for taking on the toughest opponents and coming out on top. But then something had happened, something that had made him walk away from it all. The details were murky, even to those who'd been closest to him. Some said it was a personal tragedy. Others whispered about a scandal that had forced him into hiding. Whatever the truth was, Jack had left that life behind and come to this town to start over. But the past has a way of catching up with you, and Jack had always known that his quiet life might not last forever. He just hadn't expected it to end like this. The day Vince confronted Jack in the park, It started like any other. Jack was sitting on a bench, reading a book, when Vince and his crew swaggered over. Vince had been drinking, and his usual bravado was amplified by the alcohol. He'd noticed Jack before, the quiet guy who never seemed to react to anything, and he'd decided that today was the day he'd get a rise out of him. "Hey, bookworm," Vince sneered, snatching the book out of Jack's hands. "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this? You lost or something?" Jack had looked up calmly, his expression unreadable. "I'm just reading," he'd said, his voice steady. But Vince wasn't satisfied. He'd shoved Jack hard enough to knock him off the bench, and the rest of his crew had laughed. "What's the matter?" Vince taunted. "You gonna cry about it?" Jack had gotten to his feet, brushing himself off, and for a moment it seemed like he might just walk away. But then something in his demeanor shifted, a subtle change that only someone who knew what to look for would notice. His shoulders squared, his hands clenched into fists, and his eyes, usually so calm and distant, took on a steely intensity. "You don't want to do this," he'd said quietly. But Vince, drunk on his own arrogance, had laughed. "Oh, I think I do," he'd replied, stepping closer. And that's when the tension in the air became palpable, like the calm before a storm. As the confrontation unfolded, the townsfolk who'd gathered to watch held their breath. They'd seen Vince in action before, and they knew how this usually ended. But there was something about Jack, something in the way he stood, the way he moved, that made them wonder if maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. And then, just as Vince threw the first punch, Jack did something that no one expected. He dodged it with a speed and precision that seemed almost inhuman, and in one fluid motion, he countered with a blow that sent Vince sprawling to the ground. The crowd gasped, and for a moment there was complete silence. Vince, dazed and bleeding from the nose, looked up at Jack with a mixture of shock and fear. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Jack had looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "Someone you shouldn't have messed with," he'd replied. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Vince and the rest of the town to wonder what had just happened. But the story doesn't end there. In the days that followed, rumors began to swirl about Jack's past. Some said he was a former Marine. Others claimed he'd been a professional fighter who'd walked away after a tragic accident. There were even whispers that he'd been involved in something darker, something that had forced him to disappear. Vince, for his part, was furious. He'd never been humiliated like that before, and he was determined to get revenge. But as he started digging into Jack's past, he began to uncover things that made him question whether he'd bitten off more than he could chew. There were stories of a fighter who'd taken on the best in the world, and one of a man who'd walked away from fame and fortune for reasons no one could explain. And then there were the darker rumors of a man who'd crossed paths with some very dangerous people and lived to tell the tale. Vince didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear: Jack wasn't just some quiet guy who kept to himself. He was someone with a past that was about to come crashing into the present. And that's where we'll leave it for now. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the tension is building. But what happens next? Will Vince try to take revenge, or will he realize that he's in over his head? What secrets is Jack hiding, and how far will he go to protect them? And most importantly, what will happen when the past finally catches up with him? You'll have to keep watching to find out. Because trust me, this story is just getting started, and it's about to get a whole lot more intense. So, stay tuned, because the answers you're looking for are coming, and they're going to blow your mind. As the dust settled from the confrontation in the park, the town buzzed with speculation about Jack's true identity. But while the townsfolk whispered and Vince licked his wounds, another development was quietly unfolding, one that would add a new layer of complexity to the mystery. It began with a phone call. Late one evening, as Jack sat in his dimly lit living room, the sound of his phone ringing cut through the silence like a knife. He hesitated before answering, his instincts telling him that this wasn't going to be good news. On the other end of the line was a voice he hadn't heard in years, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. It was his former manager, a man named Carl, who had been with him during his boxing career. Carl's tone was urgent, almost frantic, as he delivered a message that made Jack's blood run cold. "They know where you are," Carl said, his voice trembling. "You need to get out of there. Now." Before Jack could respond, the line went dead, leaving him staring at the phone in stunned silence. Who were they? And what did they want with him after all these years? The call from Carl was just the beginning. The next morning, as Jack walked to work, he noticed a black sedan parked a few houses down from his. The windows were tinted, and the engine was running, but no one got out. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he took a detour, doubling back through side streets to avoid being followed. But the sedan was still there when he returned home that evening, and this time he caught a glimpse of the driver, a man with a scar running down his cheek and a cold, calculating expression. Jack knew that look. He'd seen it before, in the faces of men who didn't play by the rules, men who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Whoever was in that car, they weren't there to talk. And if they'd found him, it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah, the waitress from the diner, was dealing with her own unsettling discovery. She'd been closing up for the night when she found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy image of Jack standing in a boxing ring, his face bloodied but triumphant. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. Ask him about the fight he walked away from. Sarah didn't know what to make of it, but the note sent a shiver down her spine. She'd always sensed that Jack was hiding something, but this was different. This felt like a warning, a message meant to stir up trouble. The next day, she tried to broach the subject with Jack, but he brushed her off with the same polite deflection he always used. "It's nothing," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Just something from my past." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. And when she noticed the black sedan parked outside the diner later that day, her unease only grew. As the days passed, the tension in the town became almost palpable. Vince, still smarting from his humiliation, had started asking questions about Jack's past, digging into rumors and half-truths in an attempt to find something he could use against him. But the more he learned, the more he realized that Jack wasn't just some retired fighter, he was a man with a history that was far more complicated than Vince had anticipated. There were stories of a championship fight that had ended in controversy, of a promoter who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and of a shadowy figure who'd been pulling strings behind the scenes. Vince didn't know what to believe, but he was starting to understand that Jack wasn't the only one with secrets. And if he wasn't careful, he might end up in over his head. Then, one night, the tension finally boiled over. Jack was walking home from work when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Vince and two of his cronies approaching, their faces set in grim determination. "We need to talk," Vince said, his voice low and menacing. Jack didn't respond, but his body language shifted, his muscles tensing as he prepared for whatever was coming next. Vince stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I know who you are," he said. "Or at least, I know enough to know that you're not just some quiet guy who fixes cars. So why don't you tell me the truth? What are you hiding?" Jack's expression remained neutral, but his mind was racing. If Vince knew even a fraction of the truth, it could put everyone in danger, not just him, but Sarah, Mr. Thompson, and anyone else who'd gotten close to him. "You don't want to know the truth," Jack said quietly. "Trust me." But Vince wasn't in the mood to back down. "Try me," he shot back, his voice rising. And that's when the black sedan appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a spotlight. The car screeched to a halt, and two men stepped out, the same men Jack had seen earlier. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces hard and unreadable. One of them, the man with the scar, stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "We've been looking for you," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "You've got something that belongs to us." Jack didn't respond, but his mind was racing. He knew exactly what they were talking about, and he knew that if they got their hands on it, it would mean trouble for everyone involved. Vince, meanwhile, was looking back and forth between Jack and the newcomers, his bravado faltering for the first time. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice tinged with panic. But no one answered him. The man with the scar reached into his jacket, and for a moment, it seemed like things were about to escalate into violence. But then, from out of nowhere, a police siren blared, and the men in suits quickly retreated to their car, disappearing into the night as quickly as they'd arrived. The encounter left everyone shaken. Vince and his cronies scattered, their earlier bravado replaced by fear and confusion. Jack, meanwhile, knew that this was only the beginning. The men in the black sedan weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted, and if they were willing to show their faces in broad daylight, it meant they were getting desperate. But what were they after? And why now, after all these years? Jack didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay in this town much longer. Not without putting everyone he cared about in danger. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery deepened. Sarah found another note slipped under her door, this one more ominous than the last. "Stay out of this if you know what's good for you." Mr. Thompson, too, began to notice strange things: a car parked outside his house at odd hours, a man in a suit asking questions about Jack at the grocery store. Even Vince, who had always been so confident, started looking over his shoulder, his bravado replaced by a growing sense of paranoia. It was as if the entire town had been drawn into Jack's world, a world of secrets, danger, and unanswered questions. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, one thing became clear: this wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, waiting for the right moment to explode. But what was it? And who was really pulling the strings? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But with every step closer to the truth, the stakes grew higher and the danger more real. Jack knew that he couldn't run forever, but he also knew that staying meant risking everything. And as the tension continued to build, one question loomed larger than all the others. How far would he go to protect the people he cared about? The answer, when it came, would change everything. But for now, the mystery remained unsolved, the tension unbroken, and the truth just out of reach. And as the audience, you're left wondering what happens next. Who can be trusted? And what secrets are still waiting to be revealed? The only way to find out is to keep watching, because this story is far from over. Just when it seemed like the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, the story took a sharp, unexpected turn, one that would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew. It all began with a visit from someone Jack never expected to see again. Late one evening, as he sat in his garage, going through old boxing memorabilia he hadn't touched in years, there was a knock at the door. Jack hesitated, his instincts on high alert. He wasn't expecting anyone, and after the recent events, he wasn't taking any chances. But when he opened the door, he was met with a face he hadn't seen in over a decade, his older brother, Michael. The two men stood there for a moment, staring at each other in stunned silence. Michael looked older, more worn down, but there was no mistaking him. And yet, something about his presence felt off. Jack hadn't spoken to his brother since the night he'd walked away from his boxing career, and the memories of that night came flooding back in an instant. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for something or someone. "We need to talk," he said finally, his tone grave. "It's about Dad." The mention of their father sent a jolt through Jack. Their dad had been a legendary figure in the boxing world, a man who'd trained some of the greatest fighters of his generation. But he'd also been a deeply flawed man, someone who'd let his ambition and ego destroy his relationships with his family. Jack had always blamed his father for the way things had ended between them, but he'd never talked about it, not with Michael, not with anyone. And now, here was Michael, standing in his garage, bringing up the past in a way that made Jack's stomach twist. "What about him?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael hesitated, as if he were weighing his words carefully. "He's gone," he said finally. "He died last week. And before he did, he told me something you need to know." Jack's mind raced. His father had been out of his life for so long that the news of his death didn't hit him the way he thought it would. But there was something in Michael's tone, something in the way he was looking at him that made Jack's skin crawl. "What did he say?" Jack asked, his voice tight. Michael took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. "He said the fight you walked away from, the one that ended your career, it wasn't what you thought. There was more to it. A lot more." Jack felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. That fight had been the defining moment of his life, the reason he'd walked away from everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. He'd always believed it was a clean fight, that he'd lost fair and square. But now, Michael was telling him that wasn't the case. "What are you talking about?" Jack demanded, his voice rising. Michael hesitated again, as if he were afraid to say the words out loud. "Dad was involved," he said finally. "He made a deal with the promoter, a deal to throw the fight. He thought it would be an easy payday, but it backfired. The promoter double-crossed him, and when Dad tried to back out, they threatened him. Threatened all of us. That's why he pushed you so hard, why he wanted you to win no matter what. He was trying to make up for what he'd done." Jack felt like he'd been punched in the gut. All these years, he'd blamed himself for losing that fight, for not being strong enough, fast enough, good enough. But now, he was being told that it had never been about him at all. It had been about his father's greed, his desperation, his mistakes. And the worst part? Jack had never known. He'd spent years carrying the weight of that loss, and now he was being told it had all been a lie. But the revelations didn't stop there. As Jack struggled to process what Michael had told him, his brother dropped another bombshell. "There's something else," Michael said, his voice low. "The men who are after you, they're not just some random thugs. They're connected to the promoter Dad made the deal with. And they're not just looking for you. They're looking for something you have, something they think you took from them." Jack's mind raced. He didn't have anything, at least nothing that he knew of. But then, a memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. After the fight, his father had given him a small locked box, telling him to keep it safe and never open it. Jack had assumed it was just some sentimental trinket, something his father had wanted him to have. But now, he wasn't so sure. "What's in the box?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, they think it's worth killing for. And if they find out you have it, they're not going to stop until they get it back." The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. Jack had always thought his father's betrayal was personal, that it was about control, about ego. But now, he was starting to see that it was part of something much bigger, a web of lies, secrets, and corruption that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. And he was right in the middle of it. But the question remained, what was in the box? And why was it so important? Jack didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't trust anyone, not even Michael. Because if his father had been willing to sacrifice everything for a payday, what was to stop Michael from doing the same? And as the tension continued to build, one thing became clear. The mystery wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about his family, his past, and the choices they'd all made, choices that were coming back to haunt them in ways none of them could have predicted. But the twists didn't end there. As Jack and Michael talked late into the night, a figure watched from the shadows, listening to every word. It was Sarah, the waitress from the diner. She'd followed Jack home after finding another note slipped under her door, this one more cryptic than the last. "The truth is closer than you think." She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when she'd heard Michael's voice, she'd been unable to walk away. And now, as she listened to the brothers talk, she realized that she was in deeper than she'd ever imagined. Because Sarah had a secret of her own, one that tied her to Jack's past in ways he could never have guessed. And as the story continued to unfold, it became clear that nothing was as it seemed, and no one could be trusted. The only question was, who would make the next move? And what would it cost them? The answers, when they came, would change everything. But for now, the mystery remained unsolved, the tension unbroken, and the truth just out of reach. And as the audience, you're left wondering, what happens next? Who can be trusted? And what secrets are still waiting to be revealed? The only way to find out is to keep watching, because this story is far from over. The weight of the revelations pressed down on Jack like a suffocating blanket, each new piece of information adding to the storm raging inside him. He had spent years building a life of quiet anonymity, trying to outrun the shadows of his past. But now those shadows had caught up to him in the most brutal way possible. The locked box his father had given him sat on the table in front of him, its presence a silent accusation. He didn't know what was inside, but he knew it was the key to everything, the reason the men in the black sedan were after him, the reason his father had made that fateful deal, the reason his life had unraveled the way it had. And now, he was faced with an impossible choice: open the box and risk unleashing whatever chaos it contained, or leave it sealed and spend the rest of his life running from the truth. But even as he wrestled with that decision, another complication arose, one that would force him to confront someone he'd never suspected of being involved. It was Sarah. She had been acting strangely ever since the night she'd overheard his conversation with Michael, and Jack had noticed. There was a tension in her voice when she spoke to him, a hesitation in her movements that hadn't been there before. At first, he chalked it up to the stress of everything that was happening, but then he found something that changed everything. While cleaning out his garage, he stumbled on an old photo album he hadn't looked at in years. Flipping through the pages, he found a picture of himself in the boxing ring, taken just before the fight that had ended his career. But what caught his eye wasn't the image of himself. It was the person standing in the background, barely visible but unmistakable. It was Sarah. She was younger, her hair shorter, her face less lined with the wear of years, but it was her. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. How did Sarah know about that fight? Why had she never mentioned it? And what was she doing in his life now, all these years later? Confronting her wasn't going to be easy. Jack had come to care about Sarah, to trust her in a way he hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. But now, that trust felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. When he finally worked up the courage to ask her about it, her reaction was not what he expected. She didn't deny it or try to make excuses. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of guilt and defiance, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I didn't want to lie to you," she said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't have a choice. They made me do it." Jack felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him all over again. "Who made you do it?" he demanded, his voice rising. Sarah hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "The promoter," she said finally. "The one your father made the deal with. They knew you'd walk away after the fight, and they wanted someone to keep an eye on you, to make sure you didn't talk. That's why I came here, why I got close to you. But I never wanted to hurt you, Jack. I swear." The confession hit Jack like a punch to the gut. All this time, he'd thought Sarah was just a kind, caring woman who'd taken an interest in him. But now, he was being told that their entire relationship had been built on a lie. The betrayal cut deeper than he wanted to admit, but even as he struggled to process it, he knew he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Because Sarah wasn't the only one with secrets, and the men who were after him weren't going to stop just because he was hurting. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. But getting those answers meant making choices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The first choice came in the form of an ultimatum. Late one night, as Jack sat in his living room, staring at the locked box, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and to the point. "Bring the box to the old warehouse on 5 Fee Street by midnight, or we come for you and everyone you care about." Jack's heart pounded as he read the words. He knew what they were capable of, and he knew they weren't bluffing. But turning over the box meant giving up the only leverage he had, the only chance he might have of uncovering the truth. And yet, if he didn't comply, innocent people could get hurt. People like Mr. Thompson, who'd been nothing but kind to him, or Sarah, who despite everything, he still cared about. It was an impossible choice, one that left him feeling trapped and desperate. But the ultimatum wasn't the only thing weighing on him. There was also Michael. Jack had always looked up to his older brother, had always trusted him to have his back. But now, he wasn't so sure. Michael had known about their father's deal, had known about the box, and yet he'd kept it all to himself until now. Why? Was he really looking out for Jack, or was there something else going on? Jack didn't have the answers, but he knew he couldn't afford to take any chances. Confronting Michael wasn't going to be easy, but it was a conversation he couldn't put off any longer. When he finally broached the subject, Michael's reaction was guarded, his tone defensive. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice tight. "You don't know what these people are capable of. If I'd told you the truth sooner, it would have put you in even more danger." Jack wanted to believe him, but the doubt lingered, a nagging voice in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Jack found himself standing at a crossroads. Every choice he made carried consequences, and every path seemed to lead to more danger, more betrayal, more heartbreak. But he couldn't afford to stand still, couldn't afford to let fear paralyze him. Because the men in the black sedan weren't going to wait, and the truth, whatever it was, wasn't going to stay buried forever. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts, Jack made his decision. He would go to the warehouse. He would face whatever was waiting for him. And he would do whatever it took to protect the people he cared about, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. But as he stepped out into the night, the box clutched tightly in his hands. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The streets were eerily quiet. The only sound, the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting through the night like a jagged scar. Jack's heart pounded as he approached, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what was waiting for him inside, but he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The real fight was about to start, and the stakes were higher than ever. But as he pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness, one question burned in his mind. Would he make it out alive? The answer, when it came, would change everything. But for now, the tension remained unbroken, the mystery unsolved, and the truth just out of reach. And as the audience, you're left wondering what happens next. Who can be trusted? And what secrets are still waiting to be revealed? The only way to find out is to keep watching, because this story is far from over. The warehouse was a cavernous, shadow-filled space, its high ceilings and rusted metal beams creating an oppressive atmosphere that made Jack's skin crawl. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay, and the faint hum of a single flickering light bulb cast eerie shadows across the floor. As Jack stepped inside, the box clutched tightly in his hands. He felt the weight of every decision he'd made up to this point pressing down on him. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. The men in the black sedan had made that much clear. What he didn't expect, however, was the scale of what he was about to uncover: a conspiracy that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. The first sign that something was wrong came when he saw the figures emerging from the shadows. There were more of them than he'd anticipated, at least a dozen, their faces obscured by masks and their movements deliberate and menacing. But it wasn't just their numbers that caught him off guard, it was the fact that he recognized one of them. Standing at the front of the group, his face partially hidden but unmistakable, was Vince. The thug who'd picked a fight with him in the park, the one who'd been digging into his past, was now standing shoulder to shoulder with the men who'd been hunting him. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Vince wasn't just some small-town bully. He was part of something much bigger, something that had been pulling the strings all along. "You," Jack said, his voice tight with disbelief. Vince smirked, his earlier bravado replaced by a cold, calculating confidence. "Surprised," he said, his tone mocking. "You really thought I was just some idiot looking for a fight? Please, I've been working for them for years. And you're just the latest piece on the board." The revelation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. All this time, he'd thought Vince was just a nuisance, a loudmouth who'd gotten in over his head. But now, he was being told that Vince had been playing him from the start, feeding information to the men who wanted the box and keeping tabs on Jack's every move. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than Jack wanted to admit, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Because as the men closed in around him, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the box, about whatever was inside it, and about the people who were willing to kill to get it back. But the twists didn't stop there. As Jack stood there, surrounded and outnumbered, a voice cut through the tension, a voice he hadn't expected to hear. Enough. The word was sharp, commanding, and it brought the room to a standstill. Jack turned to see Sarah stepping out of the shadows, her face pale but determined. For a moment, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe she was there to help him. But then he saw the look in her eyes, the way she avoided his gaze, and he knew that something was wrong. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to Vince and the others, her movements stiff and deliberate. "I told you he'd come," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. "Now give me what you promised." Jack felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him all over again. Sarah, the woman he'd come to care about, the woman he'd thought was on his side, had been working against him this whole time. The realization was like a knife to the heart, but even as he struggled to process it, he knew he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Because the men were closing in, their intentions clear, and if he didn't act fast, he wasn't going to make it out of there alive. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. Sarah hesitated, her expression flickering with something that might have been regret. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "They have my brother. They said they'd kill him if I didn't help them. I didn't have a choice." Her words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment, Jack felt a pang of sympathy. He knew what it was like to be backed into a corner, to feel like there was no way out. But even as he understood her reasons, he couldn't forgive what she'd done. Because now, because of her, he was trapped, with no way out and no one to turn to. Or so he thought. As the men moved in, their intentions clear, Jack made a split-second decision. He didn't know what was in the box, but he knew it was the only leverage he had. And if he was going to go down, he was going to go down fighting. With a surge of adrenaline, he slammed the box onto the ground, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a gunshot. The men froze, their attention momentarily diverted, and in that moment of distraction, Jack made his move. He lunged at the nearest man, disarming him with a swift, practiced motion and turning the weapon on the others. "Back off," he shouted, his voice ringing with authority. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. But then, from out of nowhere, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Enough of this." The words were calm, almost bored, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. Jack turned to see a man stepping out of the shadows, his face partially obscured, but his presence commanding. It was the promoter, the man who'd orchestrated the fight that had ended Jack's career, the man who'd been pulling the strings all along. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray, but there was no mistaking him. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Jack," he said, his tone almost conversational. "But it's over now. Give me the box, and I might let you walk out of here." Jack's grip tightened on the weapon, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up without a fight. But as he stood there, surrounded and outnumbered, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people he cared about, the people who'd been dragged into this mess because of him. And it was about the truth that had been buried for far too long. Whatever was in that box, whatever secrets it held, they were about to come to light. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same. But as the tension reached its breaking point, as the men closed in and the promoter's smirk widened, Jack made a decision. He wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. With a surge of determination, he raised the weapon, his eyes locking onto the promoters. "You want the box?" he said, his voice steady. "Come and get it." And with that, the room erupted into chaos. But as the fight raged on, as the shadows closed in and the stakes grew higher, one question burned in Jack's mind. Would he make it out alive? The answer, when it came, would change everything. But for now, the tension remained unbroken, the mystery unsolved, and the truth just out of reach. And as the audience, you're left wondering what happens next. Who can be trusted? And what secrets are still waiting to be revealed? The only way to find out is to keep watching, because this story is far from over. The warehouse was a blur of motion and chaos, the air thick with the sounds of shouts, scuffles, and the sharp crack of gunfire. Jack moved with a precision born of years of training, his instincts taking over as he fought to stay alive. The men surrounding him were relentless, their movements coordinated and their intentions clear, but Jack was determined not to go down without a fight. He'd been backed into corners before, had faced impossible odds, and he'd always found a way to survive. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about the people he cared about, the truth he'd been chasing, and the secrets that had been buried for far too long. And as the fight raged on, he knew that this was it, the moment everything would come to a head. The promoter stood at the edge of the chaos, his expression calm and calculating as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't seem worried, didn't seem concerned that Jack might actually win. And that was what scared Jack the most. Because if the promoter wasn't afraid, it meant he had something up his sleeve, something Jack hadn't anticipated. But there was no time to think about that now. Jack had to focus on staying alive, on getting to the box, on uncovering the truth. Because whatever was in that box, it was the key to everything, and he wasn't going to let it fall into the wrong hands. As the last of the men fell to the ground, Jack turned his attention to the promoter, his chest heaving and his body aching from the fight. "It's over," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Give it up." The promoter smiled, a cold, humorless smile that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "You really think it's that simple?" he said, his tone mocking. "You think you've won? Oh, Jack, you have no idea what you're dealing with." Jack's grip tightened on the weapon in his hand, his mind racing. He didn't know what the promoter was talking about, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let him get away with whatever he was planning. But then, before Jack could react, the promoter pulled out a small device, a remote of some kind, and pressed a button. The ground beneath Jack's feet shook, and the sound of an explosion echoed through the warehouse. Jack turned just in time to see a section of the wall collapse, revealing a hidden room filled with monitors, computers, and stacks of files. And standing in the middle of it all was someone Jack never expected to see: his father. Or at least someone who looked like his father. The man was older, his face lined with age and his hair streaked with gray, but there was no mistaking him. Jack felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him all over again. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Hello, Jack," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's been a long time." The revelation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. His father was alive. All these years, he'd thought he was dead, thought he'd walked away and never looked back. But now, here he was, standing in front of him, looking as if he'd just stepped out of the past. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. How was this possible? Why had his father faked his death? And what was he doing here, in the middle of all this? The promoter smiled, his expression smug. "Surprised," he said, his tone mocking. "You really thought he was gone? Oh, Jack, you have no idea how deep this goes." Jack felt like the walls were closing in around him, the weight of everything he'd been through pressing down on him. But even as he struggled to process what was happening, he knew he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. Because the promoter was still out there, still a threat, and if Jack didn't act fast, he wasn't going to make it out of there alive. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. The promoter smiled, his expression cold and calculating. "The same thing I've always wanted," he said. "Power. Control. And you, Jack? You're just a pawn in my game. Always have been." The words hit Jack like a slap in the face, but even as he struggled to process them, he knew he couldn't afford to let the promoter win. Because if he did, it would mean the end of everything, the end of the truth, the end of the people he cared about, the end of any chance he had at redemption. And so, with a surge of determination, he raised the weapon in his hand, his eyes locking onto the promoter's. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady. The promoter smiled, his expression cold and calculating. "Oh, Jack," he said, his tone mocking. "You have no idea what you're up against." And with that, the room erupted into chaos. But as the fight raged on, as the shadows closed in and the stakes grew higher, one question burned in Jack's mind. Would he make it out alive? The answer, when it came, would change everything. But for now, the tension remained unbroken, the mystery unsolved, and the truth just out of reach. And as the audience, you're left wondering what happens next. Who can be trusted? And what secrets are still waiting to be revealed? The only way to find out is to keep watching, because this story is far from over. The warehouse was a battlefield, the air thick with the sounds of struggle and the acrid smell of smoke. Jack fought with everything he had, his body moving on pure instinct as he dodged blows and returned them with precision. The promoter, once so calm and calculating, now looked desperate, his smug demeanor cracking under the pressure of Jack's relentless assault. But even as Jack gained the upper hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His father's presence loomed in the background, a ghost from the past who had suddenly come back to life, and the questions swirling in Jack's mind were almost too much to bear. Why had his father faked his death? Why was he here now? And what role had he played in the conspiracy that had turned Jack's life upside down? There was no time to ask, no time to think. All Jack could do was fight. Finally, with a well-placed strike, Jack disarmed the promoter and sent him sprawling to the ground. The man looked up at him, his face a mask of fear and defiance, but Jack didn't give him a chance to speak. He grabbed the promoter by the collar, his voice low and dangerous. "It's over," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're done." The promoter laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "You think this changes anything?" He spat. "You think you've won? This is bigger than you, Jack. Bigger than me. You'll never stop it." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the box, the one he'd fought so hard to protect, and with a deep breath, he opened it. Inside was a collection of documents, photos, and a single USB drive, evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just about the fight he'd walked away from, or the deal his father had made. It was about corruption, power, and a network of people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As Jack sifted through the contents of the box, his father stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I tried to protect you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought if I disappeared, if I let them think I was dead, they'd leave you alone. But I was wrong. I should have told you the truth from the beginning." Jack looked at him, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, relief, and confusion. "Why now?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why come back now?" His father hesitated, his eyes filled with a pain that Jack had never seen before. Because I couldn't let them win, he said quietly. Not again. Not this time. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and for a moment, Jack felt a flicker of understanding. His father had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he'd also tried to make amends in his own way. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was a start. And as Jack looked at the evidence in the box, he realized that this wasn't just about him or his father. It was about exposing the truth, about holding the people responsible accountable, and about making sure that no one else had to go through what he'd been through. It was a daunting task, one that would take time and effort, but it was a fight worth fighting. In the days that followed, Jack turned the evidence over to the authorities, setting off a chain reaction that would shake the foundations of the boxing world and beyond. The promoter was arrested, along with several high-profile figures who had been involved in the conspiracy. Vince, Sarah, and others who had been caught up in the web of lies were given a chance to come clean and start over. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still questions, still loose ends, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace, a sense that he was finally moving forward instead of running away. But even as he began to rebuild his life, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The USB drive contained encrypted files, ones that even the authorities couldn't crack, and the photos in the box hinted at a network of corruption that went deeper than anyone had realized. Jack knew that the fight wasn't over, that there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered, but for now, he was content to let it rest. He had done what he could, and that was enough. As the story came to a close, Jack stood in the park where it had all begun, the place where Vince had first confronted him and set everything in motion. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees, and for a moment, Jack allowed himself to just breathe. He had been through hell and back, but he had come out stronger on the other side. And as he turned to walk away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He was ready to start a new chapter, one where he could finally be free. But as he walked away, a figure watched from the shadows, their face hidden but their presence unmistakable. Someone was still out there, someone who had been watching, waiting, and biding their time. The fight might have been over, but the game was far from finished. And as the screen faded to black, the audience was left with one final haunting question: what happens next? The answer, when it comes, will change everything. But for now, the story is over, and the mystery remains. And as the credits roll, the audience is left to reflect on everything they've just experienced. The twists and turns, the highs and lows, and the lingering sense that the truth is still out there, waiting to be found.